and we can pass to the second speaker, Iacopo Iacopini. Let's wait.
Hi.
Okay. Ciao Iacopo. Okay, so Iacopo Iacopini studied first in Bologna, then in Torino, and last year he got a PhD in mathematics in London at the Queen Mary University, titled Modeling the Social Dynamics of Contagion and Innovation on Complex Networks. Now he's a postdoctoral fellow in Wien at the Department of Network and Data Science of the Central European University, even if in this morning I think you are in Turin, in Torino. And the talk is titled The Role of Higher Order Interactions in the Dynamics of Social Contagion and Norm Change. Please.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So while I share my screen, I want really to thank you for the opportunity to present my work here. Can you see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about actually two models that we developed to try to extend classical dynamical system traditionally studied on graphs to higher order interactions, and I will explain better what this means, but I will start from a very general introduction on the topic. So we use networks to effectively describe systems in which you have units that interact. So you have a set of nodes and a set of links, and these links can actually encode a lot of stuff. For example, similarity relations between the units. But if you think, like in my case, of a social system, they can be used to encode relationships between people. That could be friendships or proximity, or in general channels through which something can spread. And this is precisely the focus of my talk today. So you can think of a behavior, for example, like smoking behavior among teenagers, and then study the adoption dynamics, so the social contagion according to which this behavior spreads throughout the population. And as you see, it's not spreading randomly, but it's likely to spread through the links of your social network. So this is the broader context. Now, the starting point for the first model I'm going to present is the standard SIS model for the spreading of infectious diseases. This is one of the simplest ones, in which individuals are divided into two compartments, susceptible and infected. And you don't have immunity. So once you're infected, you become susceptible again and can get infected as many times as possible. Now, transition between the two compartments are governed by these two parameters here, beta and mu. So an S agent can become infected by means of a contact with an infectious one with a given probability beta. And then the recovery is actually a spontaneous process. So an I agent spontaneously recovers to S with the probability mu. Now, with this model, what you typically do, you track the density of infected nodes in time. And by changing the infectivity, you can have two solutions. One is the absorbing state in which the epidemic dies out, and the other one is the case in which the epidemic is sustained. So you reach a non-zero fraction of the population which is infected. So you reach the stationary state here. Now, if you plot this value here as a function of the infectivity, you have the traditional phase diagram of the SIS, in which the phase space is split into two regions. You have the epidemic-free region here, and then you have the endemic region here, in which a non-zero fraction of the population is infected in the long-term regime. Now, this is our starting point. This is called simple contagion, this mechanism that I just described, and it has been used a lot for the spreading of infectious diseases, and it has two fundamental assumptions. One is that transmission event occurs through the links, so pairwise interactions among the units. So in this case, this agent here can get infected by these three infected neighbors with a given probability beta. The second assumption is that these sources of infections are actually independent. So in this case, I can get infected by this one or independently from this one and this one. This is completely independent. Now, when you move away from the epidemiological context and you embrace the context of sociology or social contagion in general, so you model the dynamics of spreading of behaviors, rumors, fads, and beliefs, the picture should change a bit, because there is a lot of empirical evidence that says that this is not how it works, because you have, most of the time, more complex mechanisms of peer pressure and social influence that are in place, so that multiple sources of activations are actually required for a transmission event to happen. So these events here are not independent anymore. You can think of the simplest example, which is the famous threshold model, such that you need a threshold, you have a threshold and you need to have a number of your friends which is above this threshold in order to adopt. So let's say you use C for coding, you need to have, I don't know, more than 50% of your friends to switch to Python before you switch. And this is well known for social contagions. But there is still one other assumption here that it's kept fixed until now, which is the fact that you use pairwise links as a description of your social systems. However, it's a bit hard to imagine the fabric of the social system we live in as composed solely by pairwise interactions, where most of the time we actually interact in groups, which are formed by more than 2 units at the same time. And I give you a quick example. Let's say you go to a bar and you want to order something. One thing is if you're by yourself, which is also a bit sad maybe, but as soon as the table starts to grow, you have more and more peer pressure that comes in, and these are simultaneous influences that play a role. So let's say you wanted to go for a beer, but the table starts to order wine, then you're way more likely, because of the simultaneous effects, to switch to wine in this case. Now, the question at this point is, are networks enough to encode these many-body interactions? Sometimes you might want to switch the network representation instead in favor of a higher order one. So in this case, for example, these 3 nodes are connected by 3 links. And in here, they are connected by one single object, which is this 3-body interaction I'm picturing with the shaded gray. I give you an example which is very popular among network scientists, which is the case of co-authorship. So in this case, we have 3 papers published by pairs of individuals, and in the network case, this would be a triangle. However, this is fundamentally different from having one single paper co-authored by 3 people at the same time. So this is the sum of 3 pairwise interaction. This is one 3-body interaction, and the network will not be able to encode this type of relation here. So what we need to do is to move away from having building blocks, which are links, and instead use what are called simplices or hyperlinks, which are simple sets of nodes. And then if you glue them together, you obtain what is not a graph anymore, but is either a simplicial complex or a hypergraph, where the only difference is that in the simplicial complex, you also have an additional requirement that all the subsimplices need to be included in the complex. So if you have 2 simplexes, like in this case, you also need to have in the complex the 3 links contained and the 3 nodes. And this is true for all the orders of the complex. Now, we're going to use this structure here to extend the SIS model we had before in what we call the Simplagian model for simplicial contagion. So we start from the same case I described before. So this node can get infected by means of these traditional channels, which are the one simplices from the infectious neighbors. But now, let's say that the node is also part of this 3-body interaction, this triangle here. And let's say that the other 2 nodes are infected as well. So all the nodes in the group except I are infected. Then you can think of the group itself as infectious, and this will infect I with a different probability of infection, which is beta triangle. So if you stop at dimension 2, you have these different possible channels of infection that would be our control parameters. You can normalize them with the standard recovery probability, and also take into account the average connectivity of the graph. So you basically rescale it by the number of average connections in terms of link and in terms of triangle, and you end up with these 2 parameters here. Now, to test the model, we need some structures. So we rely on temporally resolved interactions that have been recorded with proximity censored on top of participants in different contexts. So you have interactions from which you can actually build simultaneous groups that formed in time, and then you glue all the groups together and you end up with this simplicial complex. And now we use it as a substrate on top of which to run our SIS model. So here I'm turning off the higher order contributions. So the parameters for the triangles is to 0. So what you have for the 4 different contexts I'm showing is the exact same picture I showed you before for the SIS. No epidemics and endemic state as before. However, if you turn on the higher order contributions, the picture changes quite a lot. And it does it more or less qualitatively, let's say, in a similar way across the different contexts, even though they're very different. So the epidemic threshold moves back. So the epidemic starts before, and you have some signatures here of what seems to be stability. But notice that here the social structures are very different. Like in this one, in high school, you have communities. In the conference, you have a big blob of people interacting all at the same time. So to understand what is going on, we need to go back one step and maybe use analytics. So we devised a standard mean field approach, widely used for graphs, in which you assume that all the nodes behave the same and have the same number of contacts on average. And then you can write down explicitly the equation for the temporal evolution of the density of infected nodes. So you account for those that recover, and then you add those that get infected. So node I could get infected on average. So you have K average friends. Each one of them is infected with probability rho and infects I with probability beta. This is the standard SIS. And then we add our contribution, which is the effect of the two simplices. So this node I is part of a two simplex. On average, there are K triangle two simplices incident on node I. Each one has probability of having the other two infected, which is rho squared, and then the simplex infects I with probability B triangle. You can solve this. This is a simple second order equation. And you have up to 3 acceptable solutions. One is this standard absorbing state, which is epidemic free. But then you also have 2 additional solutions whose stability depends on the parameters of the model. So I'm going to show you the results just with a figure. So if the higher order contribution, so the infectivity of the triangles is between 0 and 1, you have a picture which is very similar to the SIS, with the difference that when you are in the endemic state, you have a higher density of infected nodes. When instead you push the social influence given by the groups even further, what happens is that you have 2 things. One, the epidemic threshold moves back. So when there is a contagion, it happens before and it happens abruptly. So the nature of the transition changes dramatically from being a continuous one to a first order, to a discontinuous transition. We tried to back up this with simulations, so we relied on random simplicial complexes for which we could control the average connectivity properties. And you see that even this simple mean field assumption can capture both the position of the threshold and the nature of the transition. Obviously, it's not precise. If you want to have a better analytical description, you need to move to more sophisticated heterogeneous formalisms. We can talk about that. There have been a lot of studies on that as well that confirm what we see actually in the mean field. So to sum up this first bit, just by introducing up to the SIS, on top of the SIS, a simple model for group level social contagion, we observed that we found a change in the phase diagram that moved from having a continuous transition to an abrupt transition. And this is something that actually happens a lot when you start to look at different processes, such as synchronization, when you start introducing from weak to strong higher order interactions in the system. Here, you can think of a generic macroscopic order parameters, but let's say in synchronization, when you control for the coupling strength of the different oscillators, you have the same behavior. So the transition becomes discontinuous. So here, this is just a conjecture for the moment, but this could be a general pathway that leads to explosive phenomena in complex systems. And there is a lot of research to be done to actually test when and how these effects appear when you introduce higher order interactions. Now, I want to also stress one thing that comes for free whenever you have abrupt transitions, which is the factor of B-stability. So here, you have the unstable branch of the solution in this part of the phase space that naturally splits the phase space into 2 basins of attraction. So that if you start with the seed of adopters, which is too low, it's below this value here, you naturally have the epidemics that dies out. If you start above, you reach the stationary state and the epidemic is sustained. This is in line with a lot of research that has been done in the context of critical mass dynamics to induce social change. So there is a connection between the theory that comes out of the adding the group interactions and the something that has been observed for social system, which is the presence of critical mass. And this links to the second part of the talk, which is precisely about critical masses and why we care about critical masses. So critical mass theory argues that we can change apparently stable social conventions if there is a committed minority of individuals that reaches a critical size, so a critical fraction of the populations. So regular individuals can actually change social conventions and norms through critical mass theory. Now, why do we care about changing social conventions and norms, you might ask? Because they've been proposed as possible solutions to collective action problems where the change cannot come from the top. So there's no formal authority that can enforce the system to collectively behave differently, but the change needs to come from the bottom, so from local coordination. There is evidence that when the norms change, it happens abruptly, more or less as we saw before. And it does so when the system reaches the tipping point. You can easily think of an example of the use of public transport in a city as opposed to private transportation. So you can easily see how a vicious cycle can turn into a virtuous one if people start slowly using public instead of private. So you have this change of norm that leads to something which is at the end more desirable globally. So there is a lot of empirical evidence in this type of studies about what is the actual size of this critical mass. And it seems that minority of very different sizes seem to bring the system to the tipping point. We go from quite relatively high critical mass sizes to, let's say, 25%. This one was an experiment done in the lab on social coordination, so actual people interacting through computers. And they also backed up this with a naming game model. I'm going to explain it a bit. But there are also other studies that actually started from the data for for language evolution in many different languages, and the sizes are way smaller. So this is the case of the change of spelling in Spain. In this word here, you see that up to this point, cuando with the Q was used. And then after this point, which is the critical mass, you had an abrupt transition, and the entire population started actually to use cuando with the C. And this happens also for British English, American English, and many other languages. And you see here that you have a variety of values that somehow miss a single comprehensive framework to be put all together. So this is actually what we explore in this model. We rely on the standard naming game, which is the framework that has been studied so far in a lot of different contexts, and has been tested again with experiments in the lab, so people interacting. In the naming game, this global consensus appears exactly as we wanted, so as the unintended consequence of local coordinations of people. So again, we go from the bottom to the top. So what we did, we added two ingredients. One is, as before, we let individuals interact in groups instead of links. So instead of a graph, we use a hypergraph. Well, before they mostly studied either all-to-all couplings or graph structures. And then we also add the social inference in the system, which is the propensity of individuals to change their behavior. So I'm going to explain the model. We have only two norms here. You could see this also as the endpoint of a game in which you start with many norms, and then at the end you're left with two. So individuals can have norm A, B, or AB, the white. At each round, you pick one group to play, let's say this one, and a random speaker, this one. The speaker picks one norm among the ones that knows, so in this case, picks A, and tries to convince the rest of the group to agree on a given norm, on A. In this case, they all know A, because this one knows A, and this one knows AB, so they can agree, and they do so with a given probability, which is the social inference parameter that we added. When this happens, they all agree locally, so this one that was AB becomes only A. With one minus B, obviously it doesn't happen, and obviously also if agreement is not possible, it doesn't happen. So if in this case, given that the hearer knew only B, they cannot agree. However, now the hearer acquires the new norm, so it switches to AB. Now, with the simple framework, we can study this scenario here, in which we have a fraction of agents, which is what we call committed, that always sticks to the same name and doesn't change it for any reason. So they will say only A, no matter what, and they will never acquire B. And we start with a population that it's completely on B. So we have B apart from a single fraction P on population that tries to push a norm change with A. And the critical mass will be the fraction of this P that manages the system to converge on the new norm, on the one of the minority. So this is the case of a high school hypergraph where we inject only one single committed individual here. And you see that if you have perfect social influence, so individuals are super likely to change their behavior no matter what, you start with 0.003% of population, which is here, and you die as a minority. Nothing happens. However, if you introduce some social influence that you can think of as some friction in the system, resistant to change, the picture is quite different, because you have the situation here in which the committed agents start spreading, seeding AB agents around. These AB agents go widely across the network. They start converting nodes to A, and eventually you reach the tipping point where you manage to completely conquer the network. So you have the minority takeover starting with one single committed individual. That was not happening before.
Iacopo, do you have 5 minutes?
Okay, perfect. So to understand what's happening here, we need to understand the role of the committed minority, the social structure, and the social influence. I'm showing you just one example. So we have 4 different data sets here, which are quite different. And I'm plotting the stationary density of agents supporting the norm of the minority. This is the colored lines here. So here you have the coexistence phase, where in the stationary state, both norms exist. And here, in this region here of the parameter of the social influence, is where the minority actually manages to conquer the opinion of the majority. Now, as you see, this is qualitatively robust across the different structures, but you have also some differences in the size of this region here. So the long-term dynamics seems to be influenced by the social network. If you notice, these 2 data sets here feature the biggest group sizes up to, this is the group size distribution, sorry, and this feature group up to size 20 or 24. And this is where we find the biggest ranges where the minority actually wins. So what we can do now to understand better if this is the case, we go back to a model where we can actually control the structure. So we go to K-uniform hypergraphs, which are hypergraphs formed by groups of the same size. So we study how a change in the social influence parameter, the outcome, and this region here changes as we increase the size of the interactions from 2 to 40. And when you plot this, you see that you have non-monotonic behavior in the size of this region here when the minority takes over. And so we can understand that both small and big groups tend to favor the minority takeover. So this is something new. And this is also in line with another study that we did on nonlinear, let's say simplicial contagion as before, when we tried to understand if it was better to seed groups as respect to individuals. And you actually see that even there, the big groups can actually help when the nonlinearity is quite extreme. They can help the spreading and sustain the epidemics. You also have another interesting bit, which is even when the minority loses, like in this case, or doesn't win, sorry, the groups can still help in keeping the system out of the absorbing state of the majority. Finally, you can also study the full space, phase space of fraction of minority against the social influence using, again, mean field approach. And then you can see, for example, that this is the region where the minority takes over. And you can twist the problem and ask what would be the committed minority that I need in order to avoid the initial norm to disappear. So you can actually play with all the variables together by means of the mean field approach. So to conclude, in the second part, I wanted to show how by adding social influence mechanisms and, again, group dynamics into a standard model of norm emergence, we get a vanishing critical size of the committed minority that also puts together different critical masses under the same framework. And groups, again, seem to be relevant in modulating the minority takeover. Now, with these two examples, I hope I give you a bit of an idea of what happens when you add higher order interactions into standard models, mostly studied in social physics. But we started from hypotheses, we developed some models, so we have some theory. We put them on real-world data, and there is a lot of work to be done that deals with methods to extract data and higher order interactions from data, from real-world empirical data, but also we need methods to actually read the signals and try to understand and infer what would be the best model to describe what we observe. And this is something that is still a bit missing. And one bit which would be crucial would be to put people again in a lab and perform experiments to try to test whether these higher order structures sometimes can be a better representation of the social structure as opposed to traditional pairwise interactions. Code is obviously needed as well because the computational complexity grows a lot. So we are developing a library in this direction. If you're interested, I can give you the link. I want to finish by thanking my main collaborators, Andrea, Alan, Vito, and Giovanni. If you want more details on these models, you can find some references in here. While if you're interested more in general to higher order representations, for example, this is a quite comprehensive review on both the structure and the dynamics of hypergraphs and simplicial complexes. While here we have a little perspective on what are the new challenges for this new physics that might come when you adopt these new representations. I'm done. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm open to questions if you have any.
Thank you, Iacopo. Thank you. Okay. Actually, first of all, I would like to apologize with Rosario Mantegna, who had raised his hands, I think, at the end of this first session, but I have realized, I have seen the raise handed only after.
No problem, Paolo.
Okay. Okay, so please, are there questions, comments on the talk of Iacopo? If not, I might put you a question concerning the first part of your talk. So you have introduced group interactions passing from graphs to hypergraphs, and you have also introduced norm evolution, and this changes the phase diagram, and for example the infection transition is no more continuous, it is first order. But what is in this change of the order of the transition the role of group interaction and the role of norm evolution?
Okay, so in the first work, what we actually did was to get the simplest extension of the SIS model, and we add basically one more channel through which an infection can spread, which is the effect of the groups. So there is no really an evolution in the process. That's more for the second part of the talk, for the other model. I understand that I explained them quite the limit. It's a bit vague, but in the first part we only actually introduce groups. So it comes directly from the fact that you have this new challenge of infections that allow you to get infected. So on the analytical part, it comes from adding this requirement that you're part of a group of which other individuals need to be infected. So you have a rho squared in there that analytically gives you the second order equation, and then that gives you more solutions. But this has also been found when you change with the infection kernel. So even if you have a less strict condition on when a group you're part of is infectious, this phenomena emerge as well. So it's quite, it's something that is actually a signature of the higher order interaction per se.
But in the mean field equation where you had written 1 minus rho times rho square, yes, the rho square comes from the group interaction.
Yes, the rho squared comes from the, I can show you, yeah, the rho squared comes from here. So this is, since you're in the mean field, you could say that the probability that these two neighbors of yours are infectious is the actual density of infected nodes in the entire graph. And that's why you say rho squared. So this one is
for higher order group interaction, rho square becomes rho up to some power.
This one. Yes, you can write down. Write this down up to any order, and obviously this is hard to solve because then you have as many parameters and as many orders. But what we were able to show is that if you just keep standard pairwise interaction, so the first term and an arbitrary higher order terms, so let's say the one group 7, and you control for these two parameters, so you're back with only 2 parameters, then the picture doesn't change.
Okay.